Good evening and welcome to this virtual Grand Round sponsored by the DEI Committee of AAST. I am honored to be joined by a very talented panel of surgeons to explore navigating conflict, finding a balance in challenging situations. The format for today's Grand Rounds will begin with presentations by our panelists, followed by Q&As, then comments on some thought-provoking scenarios, and end with closing remarks. We welcome interaction from the audience, so please post your comments, questions in the chat. Before we dive in, please note that the AAST no longer offers CME for live Grand Rounds. Should CME be available for the archived version of the Grand Rounds, those who watch today's webinar will receive an email once the archived version is available on the AAST website and prompt you to log in and claim CME. Trying to change slides. Hold on, guys. So I have nothing to disclose. No financial disclosures. I do serve on the board of directors of Physician Just Equity, receive no compensation in that role. So some of us still use the dictionary. Merriam-Webster defines navigating as to plan, manage, or find your way, and conflict as a mental struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, or wishes. I think these definitions really are germane to our discussion today. Sorry. My computer, apologies. With the wisdom and expertise of our panel, we will explore strategies for effective navigation, consider how to frame the conversations we often need to have, find solutions, manage our emotions in these high stakes and often very high intensity situations, and lastly, realize hopefully what not to do. Hang on, just the slowness of the computer. As we navigate these challenging situations, it's important to remain centered, as this provides the opportunity to be responsive and creative rather than reactive or defensive. So I'm thrilled to have several acute care surgeons address three important topics. Dr. Andrea Long joins us from UCSF Fresno, where she is the Director of Opportunity and Outreach. Dr. Pringl Miller is the CEO and founder of Physician Just Equity, a nonprofit organization providing peer support for physicians navigating workplace conflicts. Dr. Damon Clark is Director of Acute Care Surgery at Keck Hospital of USC and Chair of the Culture and Engagement Committee. And then along with his co-panelist, Dr. Anaar Siletz, who is Assistant Professor of Surgery at USCLA General and a member of the AAST DEI Committee. So welcome to all, and we will begin with Dr. Long's thoughts on the art of the pivot, turning conflict into connection. Dr. Long, would you please share your slides?
Absolutely, thank you. All right, so yeah, talking about kind of the conflict, collaboration, connection, I think is something definitely not an expert on, but something still working on my skills on, and I think that's a lifetime of skills. I like this framework. So as many things, I borrow work when I can, and this is a workshop I actually took, run through UCSF, and it's here in front of you under the Creative Commons license. But it's from a conflict to collaboration in the clinical setting workshop. But I like this because it kind of helps with breaking it down. We'll go through each one of the cool down, slow down, and engaging constructively. Um, I think this is an important one, and one that as trauma surgeons, we often want to jump in, and we're used to solving problems very quickly. And this is one where sometimes you kind of have to take a step back, take that moment. And then I think also one thing I've learned both in professional life and personal life is sometimes people don't want you to solve their problems right away. Sometimes they just want you to listen. So I definitely have are we, when I'm hearing somebody and their struggles, I have that moment of like, do you want a listener? Are you in the feeling stage about it, or do you want to kind of work on the problem solving aspect? And I think that's huge. I think the other thing with cooling down is trying to figure out, your own emotional response, especially when it's a conflict that is often very personal for us, sometimes involving a lot of different things. And even when it's not personal, you still kind of have that immediate, like, visceral response to it. And so cooling down, taking a moment to do that, I think it can be very effective in how you make that connection later on. I think it's also an important one where it gives you a minute to start to think about not just your own response to it, but everything that's going on when you're in that heat of the moment. You're not always looking at all of the facts and all of the sides. We start to make assumptions, and that's that kind of ladder of inference. Is that you see something, you observe it, you start to kind of form that story in your head right away. You make assumptions, you derive data from your one source, which is your own. You start to make those final conclusions, and you have the whole story set already, and then it doesn't leave that a lot of that openness to connection. So cooling down being, I think, a really big first start. And then I think the slow down phase, and this is where kind of starting to think about all of the things involved in the conflict. So the cognitive process of it, who's involved, the power and the hierarchy, analyzing kind of the facts. And sometimes these facts, you do have to kind of look at both intent and impact. I think there's been a lot out there. I've certainly had a lot of different workshops on intent and impact. And I wouldn't say that intent doesn't matter, because I think it does matter, but good intentions don't erase negative impacts. And I think that's a very key point. I always bring up the story of teaching my nephew to play t-ball, and he, swings it really hard and whacks me in the arm. Like, his intent is not to hurt me, the impact is the same, but I'm going to treat that situation very differently than somebody who is intentionally swinging a baseball bat at me. And so intent does matter. And I think especially when you start looking at the relationships that are involved. Is your goal right now to win a debate, to solve this conflict, or is a goal to try to kind of keep the relationship with the person, or the team that's involved? And I think with that one, you definitely really have to kind of involve the whole picture. I think the other thing that always makes me, think of this is um, knowing that multiple truths can exist at once. And so looking at it from one side, to the person on the right side of the screen, that's definitely a 9, right? The person on the left side of the screen, that's a 6. If you get to the person who actually drew it, what did they intend? Then maybe you could kind of get to the truth. But there are lots of different truths that can exist. And I think who holds the power too, whose truth sometimes overrides and dominates the conversation is also a really important consideration and to think about. Uh, And I'm going to only touch briefly because I know one of our other, some of our other panelists are going to touch more on this, but I think it's really important to think about how identity plays into the conflict part of it. We mentioned the power hierarchy, but I think your own personal identity in how you respond as well and how others will respond for everyone. Um, so I think with this one, again, we draw out these things that are kind of discrete areas, but we all, I think, feel that there are many times that our identities intersect in a lot of different ways. Um, and I think the other big thing that I always think of with this is how my identity is going to often shape my response to a particular conflict. When we're coming to something in the realm of being a woman in surgery and having some of those conflicts that come up, my identity as a cisgender woman comes up a lot more, and I feel a little bit more empowered to speak with authority on that conflict, where there are other areas where I don't have the same experience or the same identity, and so that may come up differently as we talk about the conflict. And I think the last thing, being kind of engaging constructively. And this one is thinking about how you're actually going to dive into the conversation. I think this is where your manner of communication is really important. There's a whole, I think it's like the Thomas Kilchner kind of conflict style test that you can take, whether you're kind of, an avoider or a confronter, things like that. Knowing your own reactions and your own style is, I think, huge. Knowing your verbal and your nonverbal responses. So whether your resting face shows your true opinion is, I think, something to really be thinking about, be cognizant about, especially in that connection. And so showing a lot of skepticism, showing a lot of that nonverbal emotion can really make or break the tone of diving into those conversations. Uh, Looking at thinking the right place, the right time. Is this something to break into in the moment? Is this something that you need to have a lot more time for? Is this the right place? Doing this right immediately after while you're rounding or in the operating room, maybe not so much. So making that time afterwards and making it a time again that, bringing somebody into your office, saying, please come into my office and let's discuss this, already kind of sets a power dynamic that kind of breaks down a lot of that connection that you're trying to make. And I think the right person part is really important too, because sometimes you're not the right person to bring this issue up. Sometimes you're not the right person to finish the conversation. Maybe you bring it up, but it quickly devolves and you need to bring in some outside resources. I know, the UC systems, we have the Office of the Ombuds, and they have, resources, there's mediation services. So a lot of the academic places will have that. Even the non-academic places will often have some type of mediation services. And just remembering that as much as you want to be the person to create this, maybe you're not the right person. And I think thinking of that is really important. Uh, Listening, being something that is a skill that you do have to develop, and remembering during that listening phase to suspend your own narrative, to suspend what you think about the situation, and to really take the time to listen to somebody else. A lot of times the perspectives that they have are often very different. Again, thinking about that 6 versus 9 situation. It doesn't mean you have to agree that they're right, but listening being a huge skill in creating that sense of connection. I know when we've done some different story sharing exercises, I've always felt much more connected to people just listening and hearing their stories. And then the last thing, but very important thing being that mutual problem solving. When you are out of the feeling stage and you're into the problem solving stage, it has to be a mutual experience. What can we do to kind of address this? What's the harm that occurred, and what can we do to try to maybe you can't fix it, but to move on and to continue that relationship. So I think just kind of in summary, to conflict's not always negative. Conflict creates new connections. There's a lot of things that I wouldn't say it's my favorite thing, but I've definitely forged new relationships with people because of conflicts that have come out, and had very generative relationships and things that I, lean on now. Remembering that multiple truths can exist. Again, they're not always right. But multiple truths can exist, and acknowledging that is important, while still acknowledging the impact that has occurred, and that can't be erased just because somebody sees a different truth. And then looking at that three-step framework. So the cool down, taking thoughtful risks. So you don't want to just not say anything, but thinking about how you say it and where your own emotional regulation is at the point. Thinking about the power and identity and privilege that we're going to hear about later in the panel discussion, and then being prepared to engage with a very intentional way is kind of what I think is a good basis to start for the pivot. Right. And I will stop there.
Great, thank you. Very nice. Our next panelist, Dr. Miller, the critical first cut, a DEI approach to navigating conflict.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. It's great to be amongst this panel, and thank you for your invitation. So my charge was, as she said, the sort of critical first steps. And I think that one of the perspectives that I have is coming from being a founder of an organization that works with surgeons and non-surgeons in workplace conflicts that are potentially career threatening. And so what I wanted us to do, so conflict often comes from culture, and culture within surgical environments can be, as we all know, challenging and sometimes confrontational. So this is a wonderful workshop, but I wanted to sort of ground us in culture that is sort of more respectful, where people feel more that their voices are being heard, and that feeling of belongingness and justice. And this is just a common program requirement through the ACGME DEI section, which is now sort of under fire, but just to help us remember sort of where we should be aspirationally in terms of culture, and how that culture can also dictate how we deal with conflict and resolve conflict. So programs in partnership with sponsoring institutions must provide a professional, equitable, respectful, and civil environment that is free from discrimination, sexual and other forms of harassment, mistreatment, abuse, or coercion of students, residents, faculty, and staff. A lot of the conflict that we deal with really has to do with failures, I think, in culture, and the lack of respect that people have for one another's opinions. This is a statement that is presented by the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, Principles of Medical Policy, which I also wanted to share, just because I think we lose track of how things should be for us in the workplace, and that conflict is really a healthy thing, but sometimes it leads to outcomes that are really harmful to patients and physicians. Physicians should be treated fairly in licensure, peer review, and other proceedings. Physicians should not fear loss of their livelihood or burdensome legal expenses because of baseless accusations, competitors' malice, hospitals' attempts to silence dissent, or refusal to violate their conscience. They should be accorded both procedural and substantive due process. They do not lose the basic rights enjoyed by Americans by simply voicing, Americans simply because of their vocation. And it does seem like we've gotten to a place, at least in my retrospective scope of career experience, that there are different aspects of both our cultural identity and our professional workplace culture that are in competition with each other. And that is certainly something that breeds conflict. So, wanted to just kind of mention that some of these conflicts in the workplace, again, kind of focused on the work that I do within physician just equity, can lead to disciplinary actions, can lead to reporting to either the National Practitioner Data Bank or the State Medical Licensing Board. So there is a range of how we look at conflict. Hopefully it's just something like a disagreement that we have with a colleague or a coworker about a specific clinical care issue, and that conflict gets easily resolved with some of the skills that Dr. Long mentioned, and I think some of the other things that will be presented. But sometimes these conflicts actually escalate kind of out of control, and that's kind of my little niche of this webinar. So speaking to some of the tactics that I've employed and have imparted on other people with regard to conflict mitigation, one thing is to situate a well-placed question. And one of the cases that we may get to has to do with being in a circumstance where it feels offensive. And to Dr. Long's point, you have to make a decision about if you're the person that's going to say something with regard to the offensive comment. Are you properly positioned in your workplace environment to be the one to say something? And if you feel compelled to say something, I think the best approach is to sort of ask a clarifying question, which is called the well-placed question. It gives the person who made the comment the benefit of the doubt. So rather than being accusing someone of saying something that was offensive, just trying to explore what their intention was in the comment. It provides clarity so everybody can understand where they're coming from. Maybe they didn't mean to be offensive. And it buys time to give you sort of more insight about whether you want to explore the offensiveness of the comment more so in that context with those people, and just sort of down the line, whether it's a closed issue or something to follow up on. These are principles for developing a critical perspective, also sort of dovetails into what Dr. Long had said, to think keenly, to listen deeply, to act intentionally, and to reflect frequently. I like that series of comments. And these are skills taught in conflict management training. I also borrowed this from a colleague who gave a presentation on conflict mitigation. And so these 6 boxes are open communication, trying to be honest and transparent, come from a place of how you are receiving the information rather than accusing someone of delivering the information in an offensive way. Identifying shared goals, it's always helpful for establishing connection if you can identify something that you share and that you're working towards that shared goal. Active listening, as what was said before, perspective taking, acknowledging other person's views, and the nonverbal communication cues and body language. So if anybody is interested, we did a webinar on red flags. One of the other points that Dr. Butler asked me to touch on is prevention, and how to know when to kind of get in and out of conflicts so that there's as little harm done to you as possible. So there's a hyperlink there, and the slides can be shared if you're interested in watching the webinar that we did on red flags, how to identify the first steps of trouble at work and or conflict. And thank you. This is how you can reach PJE if you're in conflict and you need some support.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. And we'll move to our third panelist, co-panelists, Drs. Clark and Siletz, the conflict resolution for surgeons, a DEI perspective.
Okay, thanks so much. So as Dr. Butler mentioned, I'm a member of the AAST DEI committee. That's why I'm here. But as soon as I started thinking about how to address this topic, I pulled in my senior partner and mentor, Dr. Damon Clark, who's on with us as well today. He's extremely active in community outreach and volunteerism. serving our community here in LA. He's also mentored just about everybody who's come through our surgery department in about the past decade or so, from students to young faculty, to folks in the community who are navigating all kinds of conflicts and situations. So with his expertise, we're going to break down conflict resolution into 3 settings where diversity of experience is relevant to surgeons. First, the interpersonal interactions with our colleagues. Second, the patient-provider relationship. And third, our broader duties as privileged members of society who've taken an oath in the service of humanity. So first, we've probably all experienced diversity of backgrounds definitely affects interpersonal interactions with our colleagues. And often this is a wonderful thing that leads to close connections and a strong and flexible team with diverse views and diverse skill sets. But to take a less rosy example relevant to this discussion, we've probably also all seen situations where the person from the less advantaged background is, for example, objectively correct about something, but is having trouble being heard. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Clark for a second for commentary on what we can do in a situation like that.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me, and thank you for bringing me along, Dr. Siletz, and thank you for the first 2 presenters. Very amazing presentations, and I got a lot of good information from them. This is a very tough topic and an extremely tough position to be in and professional thing to navigate. So like Dr. Siletz mentioned, the first topic we'll go through quickly and leave questions for later is interprofessional interactions. So this is from one colleague to another or one resident to the other, where a less advantaged person, whatever reason that may be, due to seniority, race, gender, socioeconomic background, whatever it may be, is objectively correct but not being heard. Again, tough topic. I think recommendations for this is, as some of the panelists or presenters already mentioned, is to just be calm, try to refrain from being emotional during the conversation, no matter how objectively correct you are, and try to stay objective and have a very good ear to listen, understand the other person's point, other person's perspective, and just stay objective when you are presenting your side of the situation or plan or whatever the situation may be. And just try and stay calm, professional, objective. Don't take it personal. And if there is a situation that needs to be resolved or can't be resolved through those means, maybe get a third party involved, another colleague that may be to both of your seniors or whoever's involved, and or have a formal or semi-formal meeting to address the issue and talk about it offline, maybe when emotions have calmed down.
Awesome, thank you. So secondly, we've probably all been in situations where our patients are being treated differently because of, for example, their race, socioeconomic status, their sexual orientation, or whether or not they can speak English. So next, we're going to talk about what we can do to protect these patients from disparities in treatment and make sure they get the care that they deserve. And again, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Clark for commentary.
Thank you. And I, again, believe this is something that some of the 2 presenters earlier may have mentioned, but try not to get emotional. Try and listen to the other participants in this patient's care, their opinions about the matter or their subjective ideas about the patient and why a treatment may be or may not be appropriate for this person. And as best as you can, listen before you come up with this idea or this mindset that maybe this is just happening because this patient is different in some way, shape, or fashion. And again, as you advocate for this patient, I think bringing up the issue or directly pointing out or directly addressing the issue in the moment that is that your plan for the patient just because they're different for whatever reason it may be, may make this situation more inflammatory. So in terms of altering the treatment for this patient or to protect this patient, be objective with your ideas or your treatment plans about why you would like to do specific things for this patient without getting into sort of maybe if they're a disadvantaged background or why you think they may be treated different. So trying to take it from an objective and a purely medical standpoint to address the issue. Once some cooler heads may have, and time has gone by, maybe often you can present the patient at M&M or bring up the patient in a specific case conference to get others' objective and subjective opinions and also teach everybody involved in your team in this patient's care.
That's excellent advice. Finally, we'll talk about how we can leverage our privilege as doctors to be true to our oath to humanity and stand up for people, for example, who are losing access to healthcare or whose social determinants put them at a tremendous risk of dying from treatable diseases or from violence. To introduce this topic, I'm quoting with permission from Dr. Evelyn Hitti, who's professor and chair of emergency medicine at the American University of Beirut and an expert in mass casualty preparedness in the setting of hybrid warfare. So needless to say, someone who knows a lot about the medical profession in the setting of conflict. She says, medical neutrality is the right of every patient, no matter what side of a conflict, to healthcare. Medical neutrality does not mean remaining silent in the face of atrocities. On the contrary, it requires us, the stewards of health, to do all we can to uphold that right and rise up against attacks on health that strip patients of access to care and turbocharge mortality. And I also am going to share a quote from Dr. Feroz Sidwa, pictured here. He's a trauma surgeon in California who's worked all over the world in conflict zones, and he's a dedicated advocate for civilians in those conflict zones. Definitely an expert in conflict resolution for surgeons, writ very large. He couldn't be here today, but he wrote these words of wisdom for me to share in this forum. Dr. Sidwa says, as surgeons, we often forget the level of trust and indeed awe that the general population gives us. We often use this to the advantage of our patients, particularly when they're frightened by a needed procedure and we assure them they're in good hands, or when they're devastated by a bad outcome and we assure them that everything possible was done to help them or their loved ones. But we can also use this social capital for the benefit of society at large. Surgeons are a trusted source of information and analysis when we approach societal problems with a combination of detachment and human concern that's unique to our specialty. For the past several years, Dr. Sidwa has been publicly advocating for changes to American foreign policy in Ukraine and Gaza. And he says his time spent as a surgeon in both theaters of conflict has done more to help people hear what he has to say and consider it than anything else. This has been true from people on the street to other physicians to internationally renowned journalists to congresspeople to cabinet officials. Conflict resolution between colleagues requires skills and emotional intelligence that can be developed, and helping our society to resolve its major conflicts likewise is something we can learn to do. Dr. Sidwa says, if I can, as I have, I assure you that you can too. So thank you to Dr. Sidwa and Dr. Hitti for these words of wisdom. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Clark for additional comments on leveraging our privilege in the service of society.
Yeah, I think Dr. Siletz, and reading her quotes that she got from some of our colleagues, is about as good as it gets in talking about how to serve our societies and use our standing and or our privilege and knowledge to advocate for our communities. And myself and Dr. Siletz, we always talk, and I'll take it from my perspective as someone who puts a lot of work into some of the socioeconomic disadvantages in our urban communities throughout the U.S. and how that affects not only injury and violence, but also some common medical problems that could be, managed better or even prevented by some changes in our socioeconomic status. And I think one of the most important things is, as a physician, is whatever your interest is in society, or whatever you're looking to get involved with in society, is show up to those locations. So for me, showing up to these urban areas, the community centers, putting together programs to help these communities, and during the process, also bringing along your colleagues, your medical students, residents, nurses, undergrad students, to get them involved in these programs in the community, and specifically these urban communities I go to that are devastated socially and economically, so they can see what's going on, and that as they become, you know, their way through the educational system and academics, they can also keep this in mind and understand how to use, so quote unquote, their privilege and knowledge to advocate for these communities and for these patients. So most important is show up, bring others with you when you show up, and use the knowledge that you gain while you're helping these folks, and present research, present editorials, write grants to bring funding to help make changes to whatever your specific niche of society that you would like to protect and treat.
Just one final thought on that. This is one of Dr. Clark's initiatives here, speaking to a lot of those things. This is kids from local schools being brought in to be trained as surgeons for a day from our neighborhood. Thank you.
Very good. Very, very nice. Thank you, all three panelists. As questions may come in from the audience, I want to take the privilege of the moderator and direct a few questions to each of you. And please, for the rest, if you have comments, please feel free to kind of chime in. I'd like to start with Dr. Long. We talked a lot about kind of finding common ground. Can you share with us a little bit your thoughts on how important is it to brainstorm compromising solutions? Should that be done together with the person with whom one's in conflict? Should it be done separately? Does that work? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it definitely depends on the situation and the conflict, because sometimes there is a more clear right and wrong, and sometimes it's very hazy. And so using one approach for everything, something where it's a very egregious thing that was said, there's absolutely a right and a wrong. I'm not probably going to spend a lot of time agreeing with somebody else's perspective. But I still want to hear why. And I think this is where too, like, identity comes into play on both sides a lot. I think as a white person, I haven't had my perspective constantly devalued and overlooked. And so around issues of race or ability or things where I have a lot of privilege, I can listen to somebody else's perspective that's very different from me and not have it be deeply hurtful to me. Whereas there are other areas, around gender and, as a member of the queer community, where some of those things are a little bit more personal, and sometimes finding that common ground is a little bit harder. But I do think even still, by suspending your own narrative and trying to at least listen to where the person is coming from, you can still create a sense of connection. Just being listened to. Just saying, like, thank you at least for hearing my side, even if we part ways deeply disagreeing. I still think it creates a thread of connection. And that's what you can build on for that common ground aspect.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Dr. Miller, I think probably one of the biggest challenges for many people who find themselves in conflict is, when do you find external help? When do you look for resources outside of the interaction between the two people who may be in conflict? So do you have any tips on what are some of the signs that maybe this needs to be taken to a different level. And I think some of the other panelists talked a little bit about that, but your thoughts on when to get external help and what that might look like?
Yeah. So I don't find any reason why in a situation where someone is even thinking, what do I do next? How do I navigate this issue, that it's not time to phone a friend. I think that we do that commonly if we're unclear about a clinical situation. So I don't really think that there's a minimum requirement for someone to get outside perspective and insight about navigating a conflict. I think the trickier part is who to navigate that conflict with, and choosing the right person in the context of the situation. So sometimes it's not safe to talk to someone internally. Sometimes it's the best thing to do, and it depends on your relationships with people. I think my basic bottom line is that these issues can be really sensitive and they can get escalated unnecessarily and unfortunately. And so you really have to trust the person that you're engaging with. And that's sometimes hard because we know that mentorship within surgical environments is sometimes difficult. So thinking outside your box, thinking outside of your institutional environment is sometimes really healthy and helpful. And you can find those trusted mentors and colleagues that aren't working with you in the day-to-day. And that might be a better solution.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. At the AAST networking breakfast, our committee hosted many participants from across the nation with the intent of really building bridges outside of one's own circle. And so I think that really, you raised a really good point about how do you phone a friend and who's that friend and where are they? They don't have to be like within one's institution. So I appreciate that. Drs. Clark and Siletz. So, there's lots of education and courses on conflict resolution. Do they work? Do they work for surgeons? And a lot of this follows kind of that business model. And maybe it does or doesn't, but just your thoughts on, like, should we all, like, do we need that training? Is that helpful?
Dr. Siletz, you want to go?
I can
first?
start it, and then I'm going to let him take over. So in the literature that I'm aware of about this topic, I think, it has been shown to work for conflict resolution training for medical students, for surgical residents, for the OR staff. I think that there's a decent sized body of literature, pretty extensively shows that there are some positive benefits of conflict resolution training, a lot of which boils down to framework for a good team. And that in turn could be expected to improve patient safety, improve physician well-being. So that's sort of, the literature aspect of it. But perhaps Dr. Clark has some experiences with this as well.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Siletz that the literature says it's helpful, conflict resolution courses, and I think it is, subjectively also, I think it's helpful. And the courses may sometimes be long, but I often get bits and pieces out of it that I use on a daily basis. So I think it's helpful. It may not work in every situation, but I think the most important thing you can get out of these conflict resolutions courses is why it's best and how to control your emotions, slow yourself down, be objective in it, and if you need to take a pause before you respond, I think that's great. And I think one of the most important things I've learned out of one of those conflict resolution courses is that if there's a email that's tense, I always, from moving forward, take 24 hours before I respond to it. And I got
Yeah.
that from a conflict resolution courses because and I don't, but they said, type up your draft, don't send it for 24 hours, and then come back and respond. And I don't even type up the draft because I'm, you know, I don't want to even make the mistake of hitting. So I mean, so you get big, I think even if you get 1 or 2 pointers from the, hours that you put into it, I think it's extremely helpful, but more so not to fix the person that you're having a conflict with, but more so how to maintain yourself and navigate yourself so that you can best deal with the situation.
I found it interesting when you were talking about the email draft that everyone was smiling and nodding and remembering having gotten that advice. What I do sometimes is I type it up in Word so that it's not in an email document. I don't have to worry about that. But I had a mentor many years ago that absolutely told me the same thing. And she said to me that if the email is longer than a couple of sentences, then you might need to just pick up the phone. But I think everyone was really, all of you are saying like that pause, like being able to take that time and really reframe where you are personally, and then be able to have the response as opposed to a reaction is really important. So I appreciate that.
Sorry,
Please.
I would also jump in and say I have a colleague that he and I read each other's more heated emails and tone them down a little bit and see like, how does this sound to you, not having been a part of, and that is incredibly helpful. It's because even in 24 hours, there are still some times where your personal perspective is still coloring a lot of the response, and so having an outside voice you trust.
Yeah, very good. That phone a friend. I'm going to share my screen just because I want to, in the interest of time, I want to get to a case that I'd like to have each of your input, hopefully on, if my computer will work. So this scenario, during rounds, a resident is told a joke by an attending that is sexually offensive. The resident is interested in pursuing the same clinical specialty as the attending, and so really unsure how to handle this. So when the resident inquires of some of their colleagues about this person, they're told that she is always like that, but really supports the residency program. It's really helpful to the residents. And so this resident comes to you for advice. Let's start with Dr. Miller. How would you advise this resident?
This is I think, a classic scenario because it really illustrates the hierarchy and power dynamics and being beholden to attendings as a younger person for opportunities and letters and so forth and so on. So I think the reason I say those things is because I think that the resident really needs to decide how important the inflection point of the offensive joke is to them in the grand scheme of their professionalism and in the grand scheme of their relationship with this attending. It isn't by accident that you mentioned that the attending is in the specialty that they want to pursue. So there's a reason to want to cultivate a healthy working relationship for support and sponsorship, mentorship in the future. So this is a sort of pick your battles kind of decision. And I think one of the potential things to consider is if there are other individuals within this framework, sometimes we're in teams and groups that were similarly caught off guard, felt it was offensive, think that that sort of humor and that sort of language in the workplace is just not okay, and more collectively come together and figure out a way to communicate to the attending. And unfortunately, because a lot of these patterns repeat themselves and people are allowed to verbalize offensive stuff over years and decades, it's hard to pivot and say, well, this is no longer okay. This person's been used to behaving this way, and making a claim and a statement in the course of a 20, 30, 40-year career is going to be a challenge.
Dr. Clark, what would you say?
That's, I mean, that's tough, and um, I agree 100% with what Dr. Miller stated. It's just unfortunate. I wish it didn't have to be like that, but I agree with Dr. Miller. What is
Yeah.
the slogan? You have to pick your battle, so to speak. It should not be tolerated. I don't like it. I don't agree with it. But again, with Dr. Miller, you have to pick your battles. The youngster, the student, or the resident, just has to decide internally if it's unfortunately a hill they want to climb, and is it fair? No. Is it correct? No. But I think you have to have a truthful and realistic conversation with the resident to tell them, I'm sorry. I don't know how you feel, but I can understand you feeling disrespected and feeling this inappropriate. You have options, you know, if you want, if it's important to you and it's really hurtful, it's going to be a difficult hill for you to climb and deal with, and just support them the best you can. But unfortunately, it's something that you can't tell the resident really what to do. You can give them their options and explain to them as truthful as you can how difficult this may become.
Thank you. Dr. Long, you want to give us your thoughts on what you would say and what are the options maybe? And as you prepare your answer, we do have a question in the chat. So as we're getting close to the hour, if you could limit your comments to maybe 2 minutes, and we'll address the question in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I go back to kind of like, are we at a feeling stage or are we in a, problem solving stage? And I think the first one is, how are you feeling? What can I do to support you right now? Like, do we just want to talk? Do we want to do whatever? I do think there's a little bit where, because as an attending, and this happened to a resident, there's a little bit of an onus on us as attendings to say that I have to address this with the person. Like, it's kind of, I don't want to involve you. I can talk about, not the specific situation, but I do think it has to be addressed because it obviously affects more than just that one person. And I think the attending trainee relationship kind of puts that onus on us. It's not the same as mandatory reporting, but it's kind of close to that, depending on how the remark was made. So I think framing it that way of, but I want to do it in a way that you support and that doesn't affect you personally in this relationship. So how can we work on that together? And so I think that would be an important, conversation to have with the resident.
Yeah, thank you. So the question in the chat, one, how do you navigate some of the current controversial worldly issues that we all know at baseline we should not talk about at work, but at times may come up out of necessity? Does anybody want to take that?
I can start it off. By a strange coincidence, Dr. Clark and I were having a conversation about this exact same thing in the lead up to this. And I'm synthesizing advice from multiple sources. I think be objective. Objectivity removes, I think, a lot of controversy. And then the other thing that I would say is that, like, there's very, very few maxims that are true in every situation. Objectivity is one of them. And then the other one, I think, that especially applies to us as physicians, but really to all people, is that to a first approximation, compassion is always correct. Like that's your guiding light in all of these interactions. And you know, you may find yourself in some of these conflicts, and just remember, conflict is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's the way that we find that common ground that we're all searching for.
Great, thank you. That's a really good, I think, approach to help people understand how to manage themselves, their emotions, their passion for what's happening in the world, because it affects every single thing that we do. It affects how we perform, because emotionally we're changed by the things that we see. And so trying to understand what do we do with that? When we come to work, it's very hard to leave it outside the hospital. And so I appreciate those thoughts. We have a couple minutes. Let me just screen share one more time for some closing remarks from each of you on building, because we talked about this a lot, building a culture of safety. Is that something that can happen? Do you think that's a hit or a miss? So I'll just start with Dr. Long. What do you think? Is that possible? Can we really do that in our field, in our world, as we see how things have changed?
I don't. The objection is more the safe space, right? So I don't say like when we're doing things that we're creating a safe space, because we can't, right? There's things that we're gonna say, there's things that people are going to say that make it unsafe, no matter how well you try. But I think the culture of safety, of saying this is our ideal, this is our goal, is that people do feel safe in this space, is something that we could work to achieve. We kind of often use more of like a brave space, right? So we're going to stretch ourselves to kind of, you know, have these conversations, but realize that even in this conflict resolution, that harm can still occur. But how do we better able to have the resilience to kind of continue those conversations, even if somebody says something that that's not safe, or that makes you not safe. So yes, and in an ideal world, but practically, you know, I think it's more the goal of safety.
And thank you for the yes and certainly being sensitive that it doesn't have to be either or. And so I really want your opinions on this. So Dr. Siletz, your thoughts?
I think I can agree with yes and. Because it's a moving target. It's not like you walk into a culture of psychological safety. It's a function of how everybody is treating each other continuously. It's a dynamic situation. And you know what we do is not safe. We do surgery in some of the most devastating situations. We bring people back from the edge. This is something that, you know, the danger to them is constant. The danger to our patients is constant. Hopefully we reduce that danger a lot, but you know, we've all been in these situations. We're up against some of the worst things that happen to people. And so there is an inherent lack of room for error there. And in that we can find camaraderie and we can find respect for each other. But it is a brave space more than a safe space.
Yeah. Dr. Clark?
Yeah, I think I agree with my first two colleagues that spoke. Excuse me. Psychological safety, I think, is very, very difficult to achieve for a multitude of reasons, and specifically some that Dr. Siletz just addressed. But I think it's more of a culture of building safety in regards to compassion and empathy for people. I think getting to this psychological safety, because it's going to be a moving target, and it's going to be a moving target based on what's on the news, or what the situation of a patient may have been, or situation what a colleague may have been. So I think just trying to get to a safe pace of empathy, compassion, may be more realistic.
Dr. Miller, you have 30 seconds.
Well,
No
I think-
pressure.
I think it's a hit. I mean, we have to have an aspiration, and I think that's a lofty but reasonable aspiration. And I have to say that I don't think a panel like this would have commenced 10 years ago. And so, you know, we are moving towards this direction with more empowerment, people who understand the failures in our current culture and the drive to have a safer work environment that looks at each person individually for their value. So I think we should strive for it, and I think that this panel is a great example of where we're heading.
Well, thank you. This was just outstanding. Could not have been done without the talent of all of you and the wisdom and your passion and enthusiasm for this topic. Heartfelt appreciation to you all showing up and lending your thoughts and your hearts to this, I think, really important topic. For those who are in the audience, please submit your sign-in sheets to the AAST office by Friday, September 26th. Next Grand Rounds is October 15th, 2025. Again, my thanks to the panel. Just outstanding job, everyone. Thank you so much.